An Army member kicked a police officer's German Shepherd as a joke, not realizing it was a highly trained K-9. What happened next shocked everyone. The sun hung high over the city park, bathing the bustling scene in warmth. Families gathered around picnic tables, children played on swings, and the scent of roasted peanuts and ice cream filled the air. Among the crowd was Sergeant Chris Bradley, a 28-year-old Army infantryman back in his hometown for a rare break from duty. With his broad smile and larger-than-life personality, Chris was the center of attention wherever he went. His friends often joked that Chris could turn even the dullest moment into an adventure or a disaster. On this particular afternoon, Chris had decided to reconnect with his high school buddies. They met at the park, a favorite hangout spot from their teenage years. The group joked and reminisced, sharing stories of youthful escapades. Chris, always the prankster, thrived in these settings, his sharp wit and bold antics drawing laughter and cheers. His friends knew that when Chris had an idea, it usually meant trouble, but it also meant entertainment. As the group wandered past the fountain in the park's center, Chris spotted a familiar figure. Standing near a patrol car parked under the shade of a tree was Darren Hayes, a former high school classmate. Darren had been the quiet, serious type in school, the kind of student who always followed the rules and kept to himself. Now, 34, he was a K-9 officer with the local police department, and by his side stood his partner, Rex, a German Shepherd whose commanding presence matched Darren's no-nonsense demeanor. Chris's eyes lit up with recognition. He nudged his friends, pointing toward Darren and Rex. "Hey, that's Darren. Remember him?" he said, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement. His friends nodded, recalling the reserved, disciplined teenager who had seemed so different from the outgoing, mischievous Chris. Chris smirked, an idea forming in his mind. "Let's go say hi," he said, his tone suggesting that a harmless prank was brewing. His friends followed, chuckling as they anticipated whatever scheme Chris was about to hatch. Darren noticed the group approaching. He straightened his posture, his hand resting casually on his belt as he studied the familiar face leading the pack. Rex, ever vigilant, stood at attention, his ears twitching as he picked up on the subtle cues of Darren's body language. The dog's amber eyes scanned the approaching figures, assessing them with the sharp instincts honed through years of rigorous training. "Hey, Darren!" Chris called out, his grin wide and playful as he closed the distance between them. Darren nodded in acknowledgement, his expression neutral but polite. It was clear that he remembered Chris, though he showed little enthusiasm for the reunion. Rex remained motionless at Darren's side, his tail still, his focus unwavering. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared calm, but Darren knew better. The dog was alert, every muscle taut as he waited for the signal that everything was fine, or that it wasn't. Chris, unfazed by Darren's reserved demeanor, extended a hand in mock greeting. "Still the strong, silent type, huh?" he said, laughing as he glanced down at Rex. "And who's this? Your new best friend?" Darren's tone was clipped but professional as he introduced Rex. "He's my partner," he said. "He's a K-9 officer." Chris barely listened, his attention on the dog. To him, Rex was just another animal, no different from the pets he'd grown up with. The idea of the German Shepherd being a highly trained law enforcement officer didn't fully register. Instead, Chris saw an opportunity to liven up the afternoon. With a mischievous gleam in his eye, Chris raised his foot and gave Rex a light kick on the hind leg, his laughter ringing out as he said, "Relax, buddy. Just messing with you." The reaction was immediate and electric. Rex spun around, his powerful body coiled like a spring, and let out a deep, guttural growl. His sharp teeth flashed as he bared them, his eyes locking onto Chris with a mix of confusion and protective instinct. Darren reacted just as quickly, his hand shooting out to grip Rex's collar while issuing a firm command to stand down. Rex hesitated but obeyed, his growl subsiding into a low, rumbling sound as he sat back on his haunches, his gaze never leaving Chris. The laughter died in Chris's throat as the reality of the situation hit him. His friends, who had been chuckling moments earlier, now stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide as they exchanged uneasy glances. Darren's expression darkened, his usual calm replaced by a steely anger. He stepped forward, his tone sharp as he addressed Chris. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Darren asked, his voice low but filled with controlled fury. Chris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Darren's question and the tension radiating from Rex had stolen the bravado from him. Around them, the park had gone quiet. Parents pulled their children closer, joggers slowed their pace, and vendors paused mid-transaction to watch the unfolding scene. Darren's hand remained firm on Rex's collar, his other hand hovering near the radio on his shoulder. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world had stopped, the gravity of Chris's action sinking in. Chris raised his hands defensively, his voice shaky as he stammered, "It was just a joke, man. I didn't mean anything by it." Darren's jaw tightened. "That joke could have gotten you hurt," he said. "Rex isn't a pet. He's a police officer, and you just assaulted him." The words hit Chris like a punch to the gut. Assaulted? Police officer. The casual prank he had intended to entertain his friends had suddenly spiraled into something far more serious. The consequences of his actions loomed large, and for the first time, Chris realized he might have crossed a line he couldn't easily step back from. The moment hung heavy in the air, the laughter that had filled the park only moments earlier replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Chris Bradley, who had been the center of his friends' attention just seconds ago, now found himself the target of Officer Darren Hayes's piercing glare. Darren's hand remained firmly on Rex's collar, the German Shepherd still on high alert, his sharp eyes fixed on Chris as though daring him to make another move. Darren stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel path, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he demanded, the weight of his words landing like a hammer. Chris, still trying to maintain an air of nonchalance, shrugged casually, though the unease was beginning to show in his eyes. "Relax, man," he muttered, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness. "It was just a harmless joke." Darren's expression didn't soften. If anything, his gaze grew colder, his tone more deliberate as he responded. "A joke? You think kicking a trained police dog is funny?" His words were measured but brimming with barely restrained anger. "Rex isn't just a dog, he's a K-9 officer. He's trained to protect lives, enforce the law, and put himself in harm's way when people like you need help." Chris opened his mouth to respond, but Darren didn't give him the chance. He stepped forward again, his imposing figure now just a foot away from Chris, his voice dropping to a lower, deadlier tone. "You just assaulted a police officer, Bradley. Do you even understand what that means?" The words hit Chris like a bucket of cold water. Assaulted? Police officer? His casual prank had suddenly spiraled into something much more serious than he'd anticipated. He raised his hands defensively, his bravado slipping as he stammered, "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I wasn't trying to hurt him." Darren's jaw tightened and he shook his head. "Intent doesn't matter," he said bluntly. "You kicked him. That's an act of aggression. And, in case you didn't know, K-9 units are treated as officers of the law. What you just did isn't some harmless prank. It's a criminal offense." Chris's friends, who had been standing awkwardly on the sidelines, exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier amusement had vanished, replaced by a mix of confusion and unease. One of them, a wiry man named Jason, stepped forward hesitantly. "Come on, Darren," he said, his tone pleading. "You know Chris didn't mean anything by it. He was just messing around." Darren shot to Jason a look that silenced him instantly. "This isn't about what he meant," Darren snapped. "It's about what he did. You don't mess around with a K-9 unit." Period. Chris's face flushed, his mind racing as he tried to process the situation. He glanced at Rex, who was still watching him intently, the low rumble of a growl vibrating in his chest. For the first time, Chris noticed the sheer strength and intelligence in the dog's gaze, a far cry from the playful pets he'd grown up with. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was a professional, and Chris had treated him like a toy. Darren's voice broke through Chris's thoughts. "Do you have any idea what could have happened?" he said, his tone quieter now but no less intense. "If Rex thought you were a threat, he would have taken you down in a second. You're lucky I was here to hold him back." Chris's stomach churned as the reality of the situation sank in. He had spent years in the Army, training alongside some of the most disciplined and capable individuals in the world, and yet he had failed to recognize the same traits in Rex. His attempt to make a joke had not only disrespected Darren and Rex, but also put himself in potential danger. I'm sorry," Chris mumbled, his voice barely audible. Darren raised an eyebrow, his gaze hard. "Sorry," he repeated. "You think 'sorry' makes up for this? You think 'sorry' erases the fact that you disrespected a fellow officer and treated this like some kind of joke?" Chris didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely small, his usual confidence replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. He glanced back at his friends, hoping for support, but they avoided his gaze, their unease mirroring his own. Darren let out a slow, controlled breath, his hand still resting on Rex's collar. "You're lucky I'm not writing you up for this right now," he said. "But make no mistake, this isn't over. You need to think long and hard about what you just did, Bradley, because next time, you might not get off so easy." With that, Darren turned to Rex and gave a command. The dog relaxed slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on Chris as Darren led him away. Chris watched them go, the weight of Darren's words pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The playful atmosphere of the park had evaporated, leaving behind a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. As Chris stood there, his hands still raised slightly in a defensive gesture, he felt the stares of the other park-goers. Whispers rippled through the crowd, their murmurs a mixture of judgment and curiosity. Chris's friends began to shuffle awkwardly, their earlier laughter now replaced with silence. For the first time in a long time, Chris didn't have a quick comeback or a witty remark. Instead, he felt a deep, unsettling sense of shame, a realization that his actions, however unintended, had crossed a line he couldn't simply laugh his way out of. The atmosphere in the park was heavy with tension as Darren Hayes remained steadfast, his hand gripping Rex's leash while his eyes stayed locked on Chris. The incident, which had initially seemed like a harmless joke to the Army sergeant, had quickly escalated into a serious situation. Darren's face was stony, his voice even and unwavering as he pulled out his radio and called for backup. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs rippling through the park as onlookers processed what they had just witnessed. Chris, who had initially laughed off his actions, now stood frozen in place, the gravity of the situation sinking in. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, his eyes darting between Darren, Rex, and his friends, who were now keeping a careful distance. "Look, man, I said I'm sorry," Chris tried again, his voice betraying the unease he could no longer hide. "I didn't know." Darren didn't let him finish. "This isn't about what you didn't know," he interrupted, his tone clipped but controlled. "This is about what you did. Actions have consequences, Bradley. You should know that better than most." Before Chris could reply, the low hum of an approaching patrol car filled the air. Darren had requested another officer to ensure the situation was handled appropriately, leaving no room for accusations of bias or leniency. Within moments, a second officer stepped out of the car, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Officer Ramos, who approached with measured steps, his gaze assessing the scene. "Got a situation here?" Ramos asked, his voice calm but firm as he glanced between Darren and Chris. Darren gave a succinct account of what had happened, his tone professional as he described the incident in detail. He emphasized that Rex had been intentionally kicked, an act that qualified as interference with a law enforcement officer and, by extension, assault. Ramos nodded, his expression grim as he turned to Chris. Chris's shoulders sagged as the reality of Darren's words hit him. "Come on, this is overkill," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Ramos didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked to Darren, who gave a slight nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. Ramos then stepped forward and gestured toward the patrol car. "Let's go," he said evenly. "We'll sort this out at the station." Chris hesitated, his body stiffening as he looked back at Darren. "You're really doing this?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and frustration. "I'm not some criminal, man. I serve this country, same as you." Darren's gaze didn't waver. "Then you should know better," he said simply. "Serving doesn't put you above the law. If anything, it means you should respect it more." Reluctantly, Chris followed Ramos to the patrol car, his steps slow and heavy. The friends who had laughed alongside him earlier now stood at a distance, their expressions awkward and uncertain. None of them spoke up, unwilling to draw attention to themselves or worsen the situation. Chris didn't look back at them as he climbed into the back of the car, the door closing with a finality that made his heart sink. At the precinct, the process was swift and methodical. Chris was formally charged with interfering with a law enforcement officer and assaulting a K-9 unit, serious charges that carried significant consequences. As he sat in the holding area, waiting for his paperwork to be processed, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical burden. Ramos handed the paperwork to Darren, who reviewed it carefully before signing off. "He's lucky Rex didn't take him down," Darren muttered, his voice low but firm. "This could have ended a lot worse." The precinct was bustling with activity, but the atmosphere around Chris felt isolating. He had spent years in the Army, training alongside disciplined men and women, and yet here he was, detained for an impulsive act he now deeply regretted. His mind raced with thoughts of how this would affect his record, his career, and his reputation. When Darren finally approached the holding area, his expression was unreadable. Chris straightened slightly, his hands clasped together as he tried one last time to make amends. "Darren," he started, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I messed up. I know that. But does it really have to go this far?" Darren crossed his arms, his stance firm but not unkind. "What you did wasn't just a mistake, Bradley," he said. "It was a choice, and choices have consequences. You disrespected my partner and the badge he wears. That's not something I can overlook." Chris nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. The weight of Darren's words wasn't lost on him. He had been taught to respect authority, to honor the uniform, values that he had, for a fleeting moment, forgotten. And now he was paying the price. By the time Chris was released later that evening, the incident had already made its way through the precinct grapevine. Word of his actions spread quickly, and the reactions were mixed. Some officers were sympathetic, chalking it up to a lapse in judgment, while others saw it as a blatant act of disrespect. For Chris, the damage to his reputation was undeniable. As he walked out of the station, his head hung low. He knew he had a long road ahead to repair the relationships and trust he had jeopardized. Darren's parting words echoed in his mind. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And once you lose it, it's hard to get it back. The days after the incident were some of the hardest Chris Bradley had faced since his time in the Army. His world, once filled with camaraderie and a sense of purpose, now seemed clouded by shame and regret. The seriousness of his actions hit him harder with every passing day. It wasn't just the legal consequences or the embarrassment of being detained. It was the realization that he had acted in a way that betrayed the very values he had sworn to uphold. The news of the incident had spread through his community and his military unit. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had called him into his office shortly after the arrest, his stern expression leaving no room for excuses. "You've embarrassed yourself in the uniform," Reynolds had said bluntly, "but I'm not going to let one mistake define you. You're going to make this right, every part of it." Under Reynolds' guidance, Chris began a structured plan of reflection and restitution. His first step was fulfilling the court's mandate of community service. For several weeks, Chris spent his mornings cleaning local parks, assisting at animal shelters, and speaking at youth programs about the importance of accountability. The physical labor didn't bother him. What weighed on him most were the sideways glances and murmurs he received from people who recognized him. He forced himself to endure the discomfort, knowing that it was part of earning back respect. One of the conditions of his sentence included attending a course on animal handling and understanding the role of K-9 units in law enforcement. At first, Chris dreaded the sessions, expecting them to be a dry rehash of facts he already knew. But as he listened to officers recount the stories of their K-9 partners, dogs who had saved lives, tracked down missing persons, and comforted victims, he found himself deeply moved. For the first time, he fully grasped the depth of the bond between a handler and their dog, as well as the level of respect these animals deserved. Chris knew that none of his efforts would matter if he didn't make amends with the person he had wronged most directly, Officer Darren Hayes. Reaching out to Darren was intimidating. The memory of Darren's cold, unyielding gaze in the park still lingered in his mind. But Chris also understood that true growth required facing the consequences head-on. When Chris called the precinct to request a meeting, Darren agreed, though his tone remained distant. They met at a coffee shop near the station, a neutral setting that felt less formal but no less charged with tension. Darren arrived with Rex at his side, the dog's sharp eyes flicking up to Chris as they entered. Chris's throat tightened at the sight of the K-9, his regret surging anew. "I appreciate you meeting me," Chris began, his voice steady but subdued. Darren nodded curtly, gesturing for him to continue. Chris took a deep breath, looking Darren directly in the eye. "I was out of line," he said. "What I did was disrespectful, not just to Rex, but to you and everything you both represent. I thought I was being funny, but there's no excuse for my behavior. I'm sorry." Darren studied Chris for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he glanced at Rex, who had relaxed slightly, his posture less guarded. Finally, Darren spoke. "Apologies are easy to say, Bradley," he said. "What matters is whether you've learned from this." Chris nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I have. The community service, the animal handling course, all of it's taught me how wrong I was to take that moment so lightly. I let my pride and arrogance get the better of me, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again." Darren leaned back slightly, his arms crossed. "Good. Because respect isn't about what you say. It's about what you do. Rex and I have been through a lot together, and he's more than just my partner. He's my responsibility. If you've really learned something from this, then make sure it sticks." Chris nodded again, his respect for Darren growing with each word. He glanced at Rex, who was now watching him with a calmer expression, the initial tension between them easing. Though he knew it would take time, Chris hoped he had taken the first step toward earning back the respect he had lost. Over the following months, Chris continued to reflect on the incident and the lessons it had taught him. He became more involved in his community, volunteering regularly at the same animal shelters where he had completed his service hours. He also spoke at military events, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of humility and respect, values he had temporarily forgotten but was determined to uphold moving forward. As for Darren, he continued his work with Rex, their partnership as strong as ever. Though he remained cautious, he acknowledged the effort Chris was making to turn his mistake into a learning experience. When the precinct held a public demonstration of K-9 unit capabilities, Darren invited Chris to attend. It was a small gesture, but one that signaled Darren's recognition of Chris's growth. At the event, Chris watched in awe as Rex demonstrated his skills, effortlessly obeying Darren's commands and showcasing the precision and discipline of a true professional. For Chris, it was a humbling reminder of how much he still had to learn, not just about K-9 units, but about life and the importance of respect in every form. Chris's story became a talking point within the community, a reminder of the potential for growth and redemption even after serious mistakes. His willingness to confront his actions and make amends resonated with others, inspiring conversations about accountability and respect. For Chris, the journey was far from over, but he was committed to continuing down the path he had chosen, a path marked by humility, growth, and a newfound appreciation for the responsibilities that came with his role as both a soldier and a member of his community. As Chris stood at the edge of the demonstration field, watching Rex and Darren receive a round of applause, he felt a sense of closure. He had made a mistake, but he had also taken steps to correct it. And though the scars of that day in the park might never fully fade, they had become a part of his story, a story of reflection, redemption, and respect. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of respect, accountability, and the special role of service animals, emphasizing the importance of understanding and valuing their contributions. Its purpose is to raise awareness about the treatment of service animals and the consequences of careless actions,